All right. So I thought I would explain something that I just kind of had a eureka moment on. Um, there's something called an axiom, which is like the underlying assumption based on faith alone. Um, that without being true, everything following it doesn't make any sense. And basically, what I want to say is, I have an axiom in my mind at the moment that God restrains himself from existing in all things totally. And I don't mean that he doesn't exist in everything on some level, but that he doesn't exist totally in everything on some level. So it's like he's not there a little bit in some way or other, but he's also there in a different way in everything. So it's like 3/4 of God or half of God instead of no God or all God, basically. So it's not pantheism, it's not atheism, it's Christianity. Now, this is important because if you take this presumption, what is everything minus anything at all? It's not everything, by definition. So basically, God has to, on some level, not exist totally, not totally not exist, but not exist totally in at least some people and some things. Um, and basically, the point is, man is made in God's image, and if God restrains himself from overtaking mankind and giving them free will, then that means he also shares in our finitude or limited nature, but he does so voluntarily, um, and so on. So at the moment of creation, and maybe it's maintained, maybe it was only that decision and it's always the same because he made that decision. But I think it's maintained by him because he can always change his mind because it's voluntary completely. God limits himself or restrains himself from overtaking people and their free will. And what that means is there's a few things that come as knock-on effects of this principle, which is that there's like 3 existences in reality as we know it today. There's the aesthetic sphere, as Kierkegaard would point out, and that's cravias in se, or something as Bishop Barron would put it, where you're caved in on yourself and so on, and your selfish desires. And then there's the ethical sphere of general rules for society and behaving like you want people to behave like in general for the good of everyone. And so on. Sorry, I had a computer glitch. So basically, there's the aesthetic sphere, which is caveats in se, or caveat in se, which means caved in on yourself, and you're seeking selfish pleasure and so on. And then there's the ethical sphere, which is the secondary sphere, where you begin to think about like general rules for society to be good for itself, as like everyone being good by doing things that anyone can understand is good. And then there's the religious sphere, which is what does God want for me individually and particularly to behave like? And Kierkegaard is notable because he gave an example of Abraham's near sacrificing of his son as that example. And it's like, okay, that's the highest sphere, but at the same time, holy crap, that's horrifying. And I was like, okay, but at the same time, God never meant for Abraham to actually sacrifice his son, and so on. Yeah. So it's like, okay, yeah. But it serves as an example of the level of devotion that one deserves, that God deserves to have from people, basically. To um, it serves as the example of the devotion God deserves to have, basically. So it's not that you should sacrifice your son, it's that if God demanded it, you should be willing to sacrifice your son. Or yourself. Or something like that. Whatever you find most dear, God is worth more than that, because God is everything that you could possibly desire in the end, and what they could possibly desire in the end, and so on. Anyways, the aesthetic sphere is based on point 1, and the ethical sphere is point 2, but the religious sphere is not point 3, it's 2.5. And basically, there's a position where you're starting selfishly and so on, as yourself, and you get on the same wavelength as God on some level, and you worship God and you like God and you get to know Him better and so on, but you're not necessarily fully in heaven yet. You're just kind of on the path to it, basically. And then the third proper sphere is actually in heaven. And that's why the religious sphere is 2.5. Because it's not you're not actually in heaven yet, so you're not fully in claimed by God entirely in every way possible at that very moment. But you're on the big time path to being fully claimed. Yeah, you've broken through the barrier of 2 to 2.1, and you're at 2.5. And the thing is, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it in a certain way, because at the same time, when you're down with God on the same vibe and wavelength, you have two natures. You have your spiritual nature and you have your fleshly nature. Any atheist can get to the ethical sphere of life. But the religious sphere, at least on some level, is you've got a new nature and your old nature, and they compete. So you're halfway between sphere 2 and 3. Halfway between what an atheist can do at their best, ethical sphere, and halfway to pure heaven, fully claimed by God in every single way possible at that exact moment, and in God at the same time. And another thing this axiom that I mentioned allows is that it also explains, with God restraining Himself from, out of respect for our individual limited identities, to explain that we live in a fallen world and we lack God in some critical capacity that will not be the case in the future if we're heaven-bound. So basically, what it means is because they say God loves everyone or something, and He maintains our existence, and the whole phrase, rain falls on the innocent and the guilty alike, which isn't saying dreary, unpleasant, cloudy weather. It's saying the water of life is given, at least temporarily, to the guilty and the innocent alike. Because the rainfall thing was a metaphor for desert peoples, where rain is like always a gift. So that's what it represents. And the thing is, this allows for 3 stages, which is selfishness and desire and so on. And it allows for on the same wavelength as God on some level and going to heaven, and it allows for actually achieving heaven. So like, there's 4 stages. First stage is purely selfish, like a baby or something, purely motivated by self. Second stage is ethical, which is atheist achievable. Third stage is the religious sphere, which is 2.5 technically, not 3, in terms of on the same wavelength as God and focusing on what He wants for you individually and so on. And the third sphere, but the fourth stage, is achieving heaven with God, being fully encompassed by God. And then what that means is it explains how God is a consuming fire in some ways, while at the same time allowing for the burning bush, which is a bush that's on fire, but not consumed, and its individual identity is respected. And then they also say, when you're in heaven, fully consumed by God, you're more yourself than you ever were before. And it also explains how the religious sphere is the same thing, but not as potent. It's not fully activated, but you're more yourself than you were before, at least, in the religious sphere than the ethical or aesthetic sphere. So that's like a couple things tied up handily and so on. And then also, another thing this axiom explains, is that if God limits himself in his puppeteering capabilities and manipulating and mechanical, forcing something to do something way, this one's obvious, and people have explained it before, but it also means that we should imitate him because we're made in his image, and that's why democracies and republics, or the rebuking, or maybe not rebuking, maybe that's too strong a word, but the sort of like suggestion from God that the Israelites should not seek a king during the book of Judges, and they should remain kind of how they are, kind of a free peoples and so on, explains, while staying godly, explains why democracies and republics, when they're actually run by moral people on some level, or the people in general are moral and godly, as Madison or John Adams or Jefferson, I can't remember which one said it, that the U.S. Constitution is fit for a moral and godly people only, and it is unfit for anyone else. It explains why that's superior mechanistically, and so on. So, yeah. And then, on top of that, like I said, man is made in God's image, and if God restrains himself voluntarily and accepts limitations that he imposes on himself continually, and he could change his mind, of course, any moment, he's not forced to do it by any means, but he restrains himself in respecting our individual identities as ourselves, even when we're selfish, even when we're atheists, even when we're not fully perfect, but we're striving towards God, then it means he shares in our suffering, in like even in heaven, sort of vicariously through us, not just as Jesus Christ, but as God the Father, in some sense, where it's like even the most powerful entity in all of existence understands limitations because he's experiencing them, even if his are purely self-imposed and he can change his mind any moment, but he restrains himself for a purpose. And this leads into the journey, not the destination kind of arguments, although it technically is the journey and the destination. And that one of the possible explanations for this, and it vibes with the rest of it in a cohesive way, is God allowed imperfection, and Adam and Eve were not perfect from the beginning. They were flawed on some level, but they were nearly perfect. And their one flaw led to the fall, and because perfect is incorruptible as far as I'm concerned. Perfect is perfect. There's no such thing as perfect falling to corruption. Otherwise it's not perfect by definition. The thing is, he allowed that to create a journey for us to develop in our potential and so on. And what this means is we have an experience of distance from God, we have an experience of some sort of connection with God beyond the distance, and then eventually we'll get experience also of total oneness with God. So we'll have all three experiences. And that might be what God's getting at. Why the world is allowed to be fallen and not everything is just finger snapped perfection from the beginning. Because he's planning to give us an experience of all three. And the reason for that might be because we're looking at evil, good, and where we're at now between the two as a form of triangulation for the purposes of moving towards good from evil. And basically, this one axiom of God restrains himself from entering our lives fully is why this all makes sense. So it's not pantheism, it's not atheism, it's not we're all part of God, it's not there is no God, it's that God is part of us on some level, but also not part of us on a different level. And the more we go towards God, the better we get, and the better we feel, and the happier we are, and so on. Yeah. So there's and the reason why God restrains himself is to respect our individual existence as finite beings, and as he claims us further and further, we become infinite in heaven, even if we're limited in this life. But there's an in-between stage where we're vibing and on the same wavelength as God and doing what he wants and respecting him and chasing after him and so on. And if you notice, that's when miracles happen, basically. God doesn't tend to do miracles for people that don't ask for them, typically speaking, it seems like. I mean, maybe he does, but it's to convince someone to follow him in the first place. So it's okay. So yeah, that's my position, that's my explanation. It might not be something special or unique, but it's my formulation of it. And if I'm being slow-minded or simple-minded and just explaining what everyone else already figured out as a Christian, then hopefully I've explained it in a way that any atheist can understand the principle of, and they can reject it or accept it based on the simple, logical process and the value of making sense of the religious language that is often mysterious to the atheist mind. So yeah, that's my position, that's my reason for explaining this way, and this is my line of thought, and I think I finally clued into why God allows suffering. Sort of.